Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My name is fionnagan. I am a product manager on Microsoft Teams, driving user engagement, making Teams feel more fun and personalized, and that you get your notifications. Before that, I was a PM working on an enterprise feature in Azure. And before that, I was studying engineering at the University of Toronto in Canada. I also interned at Amazon in Hong Kong, which was so exciting. But that's a story for later. Now, having had written a few specs for both B2B and B2C features in the past years, I want to share with you how I write specs and my understanding of what a spec is, why we need it, the things that we all should do before even lifting a pen or start typing, and also the recommended sections of a spec for a B2B or B2C feature. And also demystify what happens during a spec review, how you should prepare for it, what you should do during the review, and also any follow-ups you should do. And lastly, I will share some tips I've gathered and learned from others on how to get better at writing specs, and a list of resources and blog posts that I think we all should read in order to be better PMs and write better specs, with a goal to ship awesome features for our users. So without further ado, let's get started on what is a spec. So a spec could be short for a functional specification. Some also call it a product requirements document, a product brief, but all in all, it is a document intended to specify the product or feature that a software team is planning to build. Every company, every team is different. So what you have or what you've seen from others may not be the standard within your company, division, or even team. And a good spec template typically evolves over time to help the team avoid repeating mistakes. We learn things from shipping this feature. We forgot to add this, so we add it to the template so we know this is important and should be included in all of our future specs, for example. And you might hear that there are two kinds of specs, a spec that PM writes and also what engineers write. So a product spec is what typically a PM would write, and that focuses on the what. A technical spec or a design doc, sometimes it's called, focuses on the how. They bring the same clarity to a different part of the building process, but ultimately they all make engineers, PMs, the whole team, and our customers happier. Now, why should we spend all this time and brain power to write this thing called spec? Well, the short answer is to ship the right product with higher quality, speed, and predictability. It's known that written communication to engineering is superior than verbal because it's more consistent, more lasting, and also raises accountability. I've got my name on the doc. My EM, engineer manager's name is on the doc. The design manager's name is on the doc. We all signed off to it, so now we're on the hook for shipping it and making it great. That's accountability. But I want to iterate this fact that first and foremost, PMs write the specs for ourselves. You don't write the spec for the designer or developer. You write it so that you have much more clarity on what you're building, and even more, why you're building this. It's for you as a PM to justify how you're going to spend your time to yourself. No one else, for you first. And it's essential in managing complexity and setting priorities and limits. What should be in the spec, what is a non-goal, what's not in the scope, which then results in a superior product since the team is aligned and in agreement. A spec could also be used as a guideline to resolve problems or conflicts post-implementation and provide any insight retrospectively. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you should not pick up your pen or start typing before you do this. 1, gather all the info you can in the problem domain that you're trying to target. Read any existing research or competitive analysis on the topic, or if there isn't one, conduct a quick or full-fledged user study to clearly identify the problem depending on how much time you have. You can also collect user feedback or telemetry data to further validate the problem, and then socialize the problem with your team and stakeholders to brainstorm solutions together. Remember, you're not in this process alone by yourself. You have a whole team to help you. And also align with your team on the urgency of this problem and is this solution needed for right now? And also team and company priorities that you should be aware of so that you can determine how much resources you can get and when is a rough timeline for implementing this feature. And lastly, get a rough idea on what dependencies that you might have, who you'll be working with or rely on, and keep them in mind. What's their stance? What will they push back on when you actually write the spec? Now, you're ready to write your spec, and here are a recommended list of sections that you could include in the spec. But remember that every solution has different needs, and you should tailor your spec based on the project. You do not need to include all the sections mentioned here. Select the sections that work for you and design and forego the rest. So some teams start with a one-pager first, which includes the sections, title, the team, a CLDR, why, what, the goals, non-goals, what are the problems and scenarios, and the success criteria. And then they stop there, share with the stakeholders and their teams to quickly align on the problem space, the general direction, the possible solutions. And once alignment is achieved, then they go on to write the fleshed out spec. Let's start with what we should have first, which is the front matter, the obvious. What is the title of your spec? What team you're on? Who's writing it? And the people implementing this. Names of the PM, designer, dev, tester, QA. Remember, accountability happens right here. And then the reviewers. Who has the veto power to cut or allow this project to happen? And who needs sign off? Have dates on when the spec was created on and last updated, and also include the tracking item so that your counterparts and partners can track what you're doing. In the TLDR section, this is important for a spec because specs are typically viewed by many people with very little context on your team's work area. So it's important to bubble up the most critical information to them from the get-go. So very briefly, in 2 or 3 sentences, outline what is the user problem you're trying to solve, what is your proposed solution, what are the goals, and how are you going to build that solution? Very quickly. And then go on to the overview section where you explain the why. Why are you looking into to make a change? What is the problem? And reference any user feedback or data that suggests a limitation or a possible improvement that's driving you to make this change. And if there's a feature gap between you and your main competitors, what is that? And if there's any telemetry or data that supports this why, include it in this section. Moving on to what. So here is where we want to describe what is the change we're trying to make based on the data, competitive gap analysis identified in the white section. And this should be a very high level summary to just set the scene and should not go into the specifics around the requirements and how you're going to build this feature. For non-goals and goals, this is super important. And the more I learn about these, the more easier it gets, because in this section, you want to list out what are the primary goals for this feature, any specific KPIs you're trying to target or trying to move the needle, and is there a specific user segment that you're trying to reach? And also, how important is each goal? Assign a priority to it. It could be priority 1, 2, or 3. This non-goal section is equally as important, because with any feature, you can't possibly address anything, or you have to make compromises, or you have to make trade-offs on purpose. So here you should definitely list out what are the specific non-goals that you're trying to do or trying to avoid here. What is out of scope, and what is a user segment or target platform that you're not going to target? And also explain why, so your stakeholders understand. It could be that you're going to focus on this user segment or this platform in a separate spec, or it has been addressed already. In the problems and scenario section, it's very helpful to list 2 or 3 sections, scenarios, detailing the problem that a user might have and how is your specific feature or proposal will be able to help address that. I typically use this format. What is the problem? What is this user scenario? The second problem, second user scenario, and so forth. In the success criteria, this is where we can determine how will we know we're successful with this feature. So you want to list out the specific criteria that you're going to use to evaluate the success. It's okay if these don't necessarily apply later on as you implement this feature, but it's important to know what we're targeting so that we can evaluate once we have made progress. Some people end it here and take it as a one-pager and share with their stakeholders to get quick alignment before they go on with the requirement section, which is a list of what the feature needs to do, but not necessarily how it needs to do it. So you could outline how the UI will manifest or show up to the users if relevant, but also what settings are associated with these UIs that the user can control, and how does it interact with other features if relevant. It's very helpful to define what the priorities are. It could be that if you say something is priority 1 or P1, it is a must ship for your feature. So these could be features that must be present and functional in the product for it to be valuable in the market. For something that is P2, it could be that these features provide a comprehensive advantage or will significantly contribute to the usability of the product, but not as necessary or critical as your P1s. And for P3, these are your nice to haves. They could be helpful and nice for users, could really help with user experience, but do not materially contribute to the overall success of their scenario. So these could be the ones that move the needle, but not as much as your P1s and P2s. And then I think it's useful to have a table that outlines the exact details of your requirements. It's good to enumerate them and assign a priority to it so that it's very clear what we should target. So one outcome of the spec review could be that Yes, this is great, but we don't have enough resources. So let's just do the P1 scenarios first. And then you can refer to this table and see, okay, these are the P1s, and we'll do these first. For dependencies, it could be a list of teams which may either be dependent on your feature or that you have a dependency on. It's very helpful to identify the teams and the owners so you can refer back to them and follow up and track the work items that they need. In the UI and UX design section, if it's a customer-facing product or if you have a UI screen for it, then describe how your feature will work from a user's perspective and how will the data flow from one end to the other. You can break the feature down into different UX components and describe what each of these user UX components are and how they should behave. It's also important to consider any edge cases or accessibility considerations you need to call out in each of the screens. Telemetry, telemetry, telemetry. It is super important. This ties back to your goals and also your success criteria. They're critical for understanding how users are making use of your feature. Are they getting use? Are they hitting your goals? It's also important to limit the number of metrics that you collect to ones that we think are really going to make future business decisions about the product or feature. So you can start with naming the metric, define it, and also explain why this particular metric is important to track. Performance. This should be included in every feature because we don't want to regress the performance of this overall system, and that we want to, from the get-go, define what possible bottlenecks may arise from this particular feature and what mitigations we can explore to resolve them before we start building. Privacy and compliance. If you're working on an end user facing or consumer facing product and you're collecting user data, you cannot miss this one. Privacy is non-negotiable, especially in this day and age. You need to ensure that the data stored is compliant, for example, GDPR, and can be wiped out at the user's request. So very important to include what is the user data, how and where is it stored, where is the privacy disclaimer that the user can look up, and how will this data be managed, deleted if requested. And also, this is often what I think many people would miss is, do you have the documentation and easily accessible on how to request the data to be exported or deleted? I know this is not the core feature work, but if you don't have this, you might have a heck lot of trouble to deal with later on. So definitely spend time on privacy if it's relevant to you. Similar to privacy, accessibility is also important because we're not just building for the 80%. You also need to consider people who are visually impaired and think about how they would navigate your features. One good example is a button that says hide might need to be announced as hide this chat from your chat list instead of just hide to help provide additional context for those users. The rollout plan is a timeline for your spec reviews and implementation. You can include dates and the different milestones associated with them. And this doesn't have to be super exact and specific, but just give your viewers a general idea how you plan to roll this out and what kind of major milestones you want to hit at the different time points throughout your team's timeline, and see how that aligns with your team or company's priorities. Holiday is a good example. If you're shipping something that's for the general public that will allow people to connect with each other, the holidays is definitely a time that you will want to hit. And also answer questions around, will it be behind a feature flag? Are you going to have an A/B test when you roll this out? Are there any special considerations for a platform like mobile and desktop? And are you going to test it first with your internal team before moving to the public? And how are you going to do that? And lastly, you want a section that calls out any open issues you have. So these could be any outstanding issues that are still unresolved at the time of the spec review, and how is it being tracked? This is optional, but you could also have an appendix section that could include information about the competitive landscape, how are other products achieving the same thing, and any references or links to relevant specs research, anything that didn't fit in the previous sections. Okay, that's a lot, and you've spent so much time and brain power on writing the spec, but you're not done yet. The big day is coming, and we got to prepare for that. And that is the spec review. I'm going to walk you through what you can do before, during, and after the spec review to ensure that you have a smooth and productive discussion with your stakeholders and ultimately land on an agreement and close out the spec to actually go on and implement your feature. Yay! All right, let's start with what you can do before and set yourself up for success. I would send a draft spec to my team and all my stakeholders, and in the same message, I would ask them to comment directly in the doc or a deck, depending on the format you chose, by a certain date. It could be 1 week or 2 weeks after I sent the spec. In the same message, I also want to include a meeting invite or placeholder for the actual spec review. I typically assign 1 hour, but depending on your situation, it could be more or less. I will also include the agenda for the spec review, and this is what I found to work the best. And between now and 2 weeks, I would address the comments in the doc as they come in, and also edit my spec as needed. Now, that's 2 weeks later, and you are in the spec review with all your stakeholders. So relax, don't panic. This is the time where you just have to address comments because you've done the heavy lifting of writing the spec. And your reviewers should have read the spec, but if not, let's follow the agenda that we set out in the previous message. So in the first 2 minutes, I recommend you to introduce yourself because you might have new teammates or new stakeholders, and the team who will be working on the specific feature, who is in the spec review with you, and what you want to walk away from this spec review, or the goals of the review that you have set. The goal could typically be that you want your stakeholders to sign off on the spec and move on to the next step, which could be a full-fledged design and costing discussion. In the next 10 to 15 minutes, you could ask your stakeholders to pre-read and add comments. This forces people who haven't read it to have dedicated time to read your spec, and for others to read the updates that you've added and contribute to the spec with their comments. Or if they reviewed it and have nothing to contribute, they can do something else and come back later. In the next 10 minutes, your job is to address comments. Start at the beginning of the doc and go through people's comments one by one. During the process, keep note of follow-up actions you need to do. Could be collecting more data on this, consider this other alternative proposed, shift the priority on this from P1 to P3, etc. Now, in the last 5 minutes, and hopefully all the comments have been addressed and your follow-ups clearly and accurately captured in the doc. If there's still more comments, use this time to schedule another time with the audience. But if all is done, congratulations. Then you want to bring the audience back to your goal of the meeting. Does all the stakeholders agree with the problem statement and general approach? Can they sign off on your spec? If you have significant amount of follow-ups or questions to respond, then you might have to clear those before asking for a close-off. Then you could say, I'll address those comments offline and update the spec accordingly and schedule a shorter follow-up spec review to only go over the new parts and close the spec then. Or have the stakeholders review offline and sign off then. If you have trouble reaching agreement with your stakeholders, evaluate their feedback and understand where they're coming from, and more importantly, where and how much veto power they have. Then make the final call yourself, as you're the owner of the spec and will be responsible for resolving the problem and meeting the success criteria. One way to mitigate this is to frame what you're trying to do as an experiment and scope the solution down or start with a MLP, minimal lovable product, with less resources required to get the ball rolling. The bottom line is that you as a PM need to firmly believe in what you're trying to do is right and be able to handle the consequences if it doesn't work the way you intended. Whew. That was an intense hour. So what should you do after the review? Well, take a deep breath. You are almost there. But remember those notes that you took during the review? Yeah, that's right. That will be critical for you to finish everything off. So go back and revisit your notes, organize them and your to-dos, follow-ups, and share them with your stakeholders with a plan to address those comments, dates for subsequent reviews if necessary, or the conclusion that, you know what, we did this review and everybody have agreed and signed off the spec, and we're going to move on to the next stage. Now, once you have completed your follow-ups, update the doc with changes in design, schedule, goals, etc., and keep it a live document, even during implementation, so that everyone is kept up to date. Once the feature is fully shipped to users, you could also do a post-mortem and add a section to your spec to document learnings and things that you would have done differently after you've gone through the whole thing. Then you could consider locking the doc by exporting it as a PDF and save it for future reference. So I hope you now have a good understanding of what is spec, why we need it, what are the contents, and how does a spec review work. Now I love to offer you some tips on writing better specs. First and foremost, I recommend everybody to start with a draft. Not with the different sections, just focus on the problem, why, and what, and make sure you fully understand the problem, the context, and why you're building this. Then block some time on your calendar to have uninterrupted focus time. As PMs, we have so many meetings and fire drills. Block those time, run 1 to 3 hours in advance, and sit down, have a nice cup of tea, play some lo-fi hip-hop music if you're like me, and just start writing. And always start with a template. If there isn't one, work with your team to figure out what are the essential parts of a spec needed for your feature, your team, and create one and use it for a future as well. It's also important to use plain English. I feel like I don't have to say this, but don't assume that everyone has the same education as you or love using these fancy vocabulary that you obtained from your SAT days. Keep it plain simple. Remember the acronym KISS? Yep. And also be succinct. Set a rule to not go over X number of pages or lines per point. Trust me, your engineers will love you if you do this. Also, if you're going to use formatting in your doc, keep it simple and purposeful. I found these things that really helped me. One is to use bullets instead of sentences for better readability, and bold words or color words, but do it sparingly to convey the gist of each point. And lastly, use numbered lists instead of dots, those round bullets, so that one can refer to a point verbally. It's also important to remember that the how part shouldn't just be coming from you. Involve your stakeholders early, brainstorm with them, they're your friends. And if you need, do a tech feasibility analysis. I know this sounds like a big word, but it could be just a conversation with a dev to say, hey, am I crazy for thinking that we can do this? Yeah. And if a section that you feel like doesn't apply to you, think again. And if it really doesn't, mark it as NA so that people reading this know that this section was considered and deemed not applicable. And lastly, I want to echo to everybody that it's so important to have a last updated line in your spec right at the top and keep it updated. It's not fun reading a spec and finding out that it has been stale and not even know it. All right, that is everything I have to share on what is a spec, why we need it, and how to write a good spec. Here are some references and recommended reading that I think we all could benefit from. And these are on writing product specs, why PMs write specs even though no one reads them, and how you can write these specs and how you can write these technical specs is a good reflection on how you build products. So thank you all for listening. It's been super fun doing these talks, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and I sincerely hope you've learned something new today. If you'd like to contact me, here are my socials. I just got back to vlogging, so you can catch me on YouTube and Twitter if you like. I also write a weekly newsletter called The Creative Outlet, where I share my thoughts on PM, design, productivity, languages, anything that makes me feel creative. If you find that idea intriguing, give it a read and let me know what you think. This is my 4th talk on product school. And if you're interested, you can sign up or watch the recordings of my other talks. Congratulations for making this far, and I can't wait to see you in the next one. À bientôt. 下次见哦。안녕. Bye.